Hello all, welcome to Abhiram IAS Academy. Let us go through the daily chronicles. So today we are going to discuss about one article that appeared on January 25 in Business Standard. So it was written by Joseph Stiglitz. So the ideas mentioned in this article are very much relevant for your essay. So what are different elements of essay? So essay can have some characteristics, okay? Your answer should have originality, okay? Originality. This can be obtained from collection of ideas from your widespread reading, okay? And it shall have a flow, logical flow, and also coherence and theme. So your essay should have a theme or coherence. It should not deviate from the topic, and also it should have flow. That is, every idea should be logically connected to the other idea. So don't think of essay as your GS answer. So GS answer may be a collection of facts or analysis, but essay is different. You can see it as a collection of ideas that can be obtained through widespread reading. So wherever you find some interesting idea or some insightful observation, you can include that as a fodder for your essay. So the article, that is End of Progress by Joseph Stiglitz. So you can find this article in Business Standard. So it has numerous ideas. So who is Joseph Stiglitz? So he's basically an American economist, okay, and also a public policy analyst and professor in US. He also held significant positions in World Bank as a senior vice president, and also he was the chairman of Economic Advisory Council in US under Bill Clinton. What are his contributions? So he worked extensively in numerous areas, and information economics has got him Nobel Prize also. Information economics says basically any kind of asymmetry in information might lead to market inefficiencies, okay? So this theory got him Nobel Prize in 2001, and he also worked extensively over globalization, inequality dimensions, and what are the impacts and why is it challenging, and what are the negative consequences of this phenomena. So he was a vocal critic of globalization, the way it is managed and how it is leading to the impoverishment, especially among the poorest populations of the developing economy, because IMF with its structural adjustment programs is imposing a lot of conditionalities which might be negative for the developing economies, okay? So he explores these things in his books Globalization and Its Discontent and also Price of Inequality. So the article explores about numerous ideas. So we are going to have a brief introduction of what he is discussing. He discusses about the criticism of neoliberal economies. So what are the problems with these, and how is populism and inequality may be detrimental to the economy in the long run? How does it compromise the growth and also force the nations away from the inclusive growth? Okay, so we are going to see that. And is it marking the end of the progress as we know it? So what are the major contributing factors of progress? How can a nation progress? What is the environment required to stimulate progress in the long run? And is this progress ending? So the article tries to explore that. So we are going to see what are the contributing factors of progress and how enlightenment values are significant for this progress to happen. And we can also see some anti-science rhetoric and what are its implications. And also we are going to explore post-truth era and what are the challenges because of this. And the article also explores about oligarchic capitalism is rising, so how it can lead to the cuts in public spending and ultimately detrimental to the public welfare in the long run. And there are 3 existential challenges we are facing right now. So what are they? Why do we need to have constant reinforcement of enlightenment values? And what is the solution? So the solution is nothing but constant reinforcement of these values for eventual progress in the long run, and also shared prosperity, that is focus on inclusivity aspect more. So let us discuss these in detail. So let us understand different economic models first. So if you imagine the economic models on a spectrum, you can see the different characteristics. So what is the state ownership of means of production or the resources at a national level? So that will determine your economy. So in this end, we can see communism, okay? And at this end, we have capitalism. And in the middle, we have numerous other ones also. Here we have socialism, okay? And here we have liberalism and also your neoliberalism, okay? So these are different economic models. We are going to discuss the characteristics of each of these in the next slide. So what are the defining characteristics of these economic models? It is about the state's ownership. So whether state is owning the means of production and resources, how is the market regulated? Is it more? Is it less? Do they support the globalization? And is there a centralized mechanism of planning in the country? And what is the focus? What is the priority? Is it equality or efficiency? So what are the negative consequences? And on this end, we have private ownership as the major characteristic. There will be free market economy, and also profit, efficiency and competition are the main focus of these economic models, and they have staunchly supported for globalization and free trade. So these are different economic models. In communism, we can see there is collective ownership or the state ownership of all the means of production. So we can see all the means of production are owned by the state itself in a collective manner. Whereas in socialism, major key aspects or key industries only will be owned by the government, okay? So that is nothing but your PSU ownership in key industries prior to the 1991 reforms is an example of socialism. And then liberalism, we have private ownership, but also some level of state intervention whenever there is a crisis. And also in neoliberalism, state ownership or state control is minimal. Markets will be more free in this, and private ownership is encouraged, okay? And it is encouraged to thrive, but there will be some deregulation also. That is, markets will be more on deregulation, not on the regulation side. And then we have capitalism. So there will be private ownership of all the means of production. State will take completely a back seat. So main motive is profit here, and they believe that market will be better at allocating all the resources in an efficient manner because of the profit and competition motives. So what is the role of state here? So in communism, let us go through communism first. So there is strong central authority and control over all the aspects of means of production. You can see this in Soviet era, that is erstwhile Soviet Union was operating under communism principles. Then economic equality. So equality is the main objective here. So equality must be absolute, and there should be no more class distinctions. So that is the priority of this economic model. And market regulation, there will be total control over the market. Markets are not free here, and there will be central planning to dictate the resource allocation within the country. And what is the main focus here? The society should be classless. There is no low, middle or upper class. There is only one class, and there will be absolute equality mainly for the communal welfare. Does it support globalization? No, it doesn't support, but it has international solidarity. That is, it believes in spreading the ideology of the communism through mechanisms like Comintern, that is Communist International. And in socialism, we have seen that government will have control over all the key aspects or key industries like erstwhile PSUs in India. It has control over telecom, oil and gas, and also all the heavy industries were controlled earlier, but now it is all liberalized. The state may not have full control over the means of production in socialism, but there is a strong emphasis on redistribution of the wealth and prevention of concentration of wealth. You can also see this in Article 39 of our Directive Principles of State Policy that aims to prevent wealth concentration in very few hands. Then it also prioritizes economic equality and redistribution also. There is no absolute equality as the aim, but it prioritizes in its policies on economic equality, and also redistribution is the main agenda here. So markets may play a limited role in this. Here markets are not existing, but here markets can be allowed, but only in a limited manner, and often they are heavily regulated. You can see this in License Raj, okay? License Raj prior to 1991. And collective welfare and reducing inequalities is the main focus here. Collective welfare is prioritized over the individualism, and reducing inequalities is focused by the government. They are also skeptical of the globalization. They think there might be exploitation because of globalization. They were okay with the trade, but they want absolute fairness in the trade. So they are skeptical of the globalization. Coming to liberalism, we have private ownership in liberalism. Okay, private ownership is allowed, and also state might intervene. We can see an example like mixed economy. So mixed economy post-independence in 1947 is an example of liberalism, because there is a role for private and also state control over some key aspects. And then balanced regulation and individual freedoms. we have to balance the market regulation and also prioritize the individual freedoms. So you can see that right to property. So right to property was actually removed from the fundamental rights and made as a legal right under Article 300. Okay, it was by 44th Amendment. You can see this as a conflict between the socialism and liberalism. So ultimately, right to property was not completely removed. It was moved on to become a legal right in the other provisions of the Constitution. In liberalism also, we have priority to address the inequalities. Okay, and state can assume a proactive role to ensure welfare of the citizen. That is, state may assume welfare objectives and ensure well-being of the citizen. You can see in US, New Deal. So New Deal is nothing but Franklin D. Roosevelt. So when there was Great Depression in 1929, so Roosevelt adopted this program to bring the US out of the economic crisis because there was a lot of unemployment and poverty. So to bring the economy out of this and stabilize the economy and revive the economy, they adopted this New Deal where the state assumed the role of welfare state. So in liberalism, welfare state is also a major aspect which is missing in the other ones. In liberalism also, we have some level of market regulation, mainly to protect the consumers and the welfare of the workers. Okay, and here also individual freedoms, equality and welfare, all three are balanced here. And it also advocates for trade, but fairness and equity are also equally important for the liberalism. In neoliberalism, we have private ownership with deregulation. So what do we mean by these terms? Initially, state will have control over the means of production and also it has control over all the PSUs. So here there will be transfer to the private in this ownership of key industries. That is nothing but your privatization, and also deregulation, that can be understood by liberalization, that is removal of all the controls or restrictions on the businesses, that is your deregulation. And this is one of the major fundamental feature of neoliberalism. Then we have minimal state intervention in the economy. State usually assumes minimal role only when it is necessary. Only state will intervene in the economy. That is, whenever there is a significant crisis, something like your 2008 financial crisis, okay, only then state can take intervention. And does it focus on equality? No, it believes that market will be a better allocator because of the efficiency, and its main focus is not on equality but on market efficiency, competition, fairness, all these aspects. It is similar to your capitalism but with a comparatively lesser scale, and advocates deregulation and free markets. So neoliberalism also, we have seen, it is about deregulation, removal of all the controls, and also freedom to the markets. That is, let the markets be free and operate on the demand and supply. Okay, so what is the focus here? So here market is assuming the role of driving the growth. So market driven growth is the focus here. Okay, and you can see examples like special economic zones. Here the state is creating some enclaves for the businesses to operate freely without much restrictions, especially in the labor, hire and fire, and also winding up the company's operations. So such enclaves are nothing but an example of your market driven growth. And does it support globalization? Yes, it supports and promotes globalization and free trade. Okay, it is not skeptical like earlier. And in capitalism, you can see laissez-faire economies. Laissez-faire is nothing but let it be. Okay, that means let the markets operate on their own. Market is the efficient allocator of all the resources. So it is a case of classical capitalism. Here state has almost no role, and inequalities are inevitable and natural consequence of capitalism. What about the market regulation then? There will be very less or minimal regulation here. All the US, UK industrialization happened because of this laissez-faire approach in the 18th to 19th centuries. And here the main motive is profit maximization and competition. And it also supports globalization and mainly to maximize their profit. So how does globalization optimize the resource allocation and bring efficiency in these capitalist economies, and why do they support globalization strongly? Because, for example, Apple has a global supply chain. It may procure some raw materials from Congo and rare earth elements from China, and then it can also give manufacturing of the display screens like OLED screens in Japan, and it can bring the sensors or camera from Sony in Japan. So all this may be possible because of the globalization that will allow for optimal allocation of the resources and improve the efficiency in the supply chain that will maximize the profits for a company. So that's why capitalist economies strongly support the globalization. let us go through different models of governance and what is their evolution. Historically, we have in ancient era tribal governance, that is clan-based governance in Vedic societies, and then comes city-state emergence like your Mahajanapadas or Athens and Sparta, Indus Valley civilization. These are all city-states. And then we have empires like Mauryan Empire, Roman Empire, and feudal states in the medieval era like your Delhi Sultanate, and also medieval Europe is an example. And then comes British Raj or the colonialism, and then comes nation states. So this is a phenomenon of modern history. Okay, nation states have emerged in the modern era, and significant ones are American Revolution in America, French Revolution, and also post-independent India is nothing but an emergence of nation state. And then we have liberal democracy adoption. So post World War II, we can see emergence of some different models of governance. One is your liberal democracies. Okay, that is already there in the Europe, that is Western Europe, and also in US, and competitor is your communism. Okay, so this is in Russia and also Eastern Europe. So these are different models of governance. But after the Cold War, okay, after the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet era, Soviet Union, we can see that liberal democracies have succeeded as the universal model of governance. So that's what Francis Fukuyama have observed. So he says this is the end of history and beginning of a new history, because the search for a universal model of governance has come to an end, and liberal democracies are the way forward. Okay, liberal democracies and market economies are the universal models of governing both the polity and economy. That's what Francis Fukuyama has observed. But Joseph Stiglitz says that this assumption is flawed, because we are going to see phenomenon like Trump, okay, Trump's MAGA, that is Make America Great Again, and how populism and inequality can actually halt the progress achieved so far. And why is it so important to reinforce the Enlightenment values like liberty, rationality, scientific inquiry? All these are so important to ensure there is sustainable progress in the long run for any country. So let us go through the article. It says, can the progress continue in this era? That is, we have seen a lot of post-truth challenges, okay, anti-science rhetoric, and also populism, okay, and inequality due to globalization. So in this era, is it possible to achieve sustainable progress for a country in the long run? So he says Francis Fukuyama's assumption about the search for a universal model of governance has come to an end is probably flawed, because we are seeing movements like MAGA, that is Make America Great Again. What are the elements? Okay, what are the elements of this Make America Great Again which compromises the contributing factors of progress? So the contributing factors of progress include globalism, that fosters international cooperation and assumes equal importance to every nation. So instead of that, we have nationalism. So nationalism is more than globalism in this movement. There are travel ban proposals and no support to international bodies. Okay, we have seen Paris exit and also WHO exit. So all this indicate that there is no support for the international mechanisms. There are also some concerning elements in this, like, so Trump has said that in 2021 elections, his election is stolen. That means the election result, he did not accept it. That led to the Capitol riots. Okay, so movements like this can actually erode the trust of the public in the electoral institutions, rule of law, and different democratic institutions. So that is threatening, because it will threaten the stability in the long run and may hamper the progress. And also his idea of building a Mexico wall is actually seen as opposing multiculturalism and also open societies. Open societies are where we can see innovation more, because of culmination of ideas from multiple cultures. Okay, and so then the question arises, the progress as we know it, is it coming to a halt? Is there a problem? Is it coming to an end? So the author raises these questions: whether progress in technology and different aspects of society like social equity, ethics, science, is it coming to an end? What are the philosophical and ethical implications of these challenges? So the article says whether progress is possible in such a world which is marked by a lot of populism and inequality. So what is populism? populism is nothing but a political approach where it claims to represent the interest and will of majority of the people, that is the commoners, as against the elite or the establishment. So there are some characteristics of this populism. There will be anti-establishment rhetoric, and there will be a direct appeal to the citizens or the commoners, mainly ordinary citizens, and also emergence of charismatic leaders. So these are the main traits of this populism phenomena. So there are examples of populist leaders across the world, historically also. So right now, we can see the examples of right-wing populist leaders in US like Trump, and in India, Narendra Modi is one example of this. And historically, Venezuela has Hugo Chavez, who is a left-wing populist leader, and in India, we have Indira Gandhi. She is also a popular left-wing leader. And then we have inequality. So inequality is nothing but unequal distribution of the resources, rights, opportunities across different groups. Okay, it can manifest in numerous dimensions. It can have social dimension, political dimension, okay, or educational dimension also. There might be unequal distribution of wealth and income. There might be gender pay gap. That is also one dimension. Or in social inequality, we have caste-based discrimination as an example. There might be unequal voter representation. This is also inequality dimension, especially in the conflict-ridden regions like your Northeast or Jammu Kashmir. There is less voter representation. And at the global level, we have an example of global North-South divide. That is, global North is nothing but industrialized, wealthier nations, whereas the South is predominantly less industrialized or less income nations. So we have inequality at the global level also. So we can see both of them are interconnected. That is, populists leverage all these societal inequalities and mobilize the support from the commoners and gain the power. So they will also promise a lot of radical reforms and promise to challenge the existing systems. So that's how populism and inequality are interrelated. So what are the problems with populism and inequality? Populism often focuses only on the short-term goals, compromising the long-term ones. Okay, and it essentially thrives on the inequalities. So there might be increasing polarization in the society, which might be harmful to the society in the long run. And also, it will compromise the checks and balances mechanism, because people will be okay with the populist leaders. Whatever he does, people will support him. So it will probably erode the checks and balances mechanism whenever there is a rise of popular leader. And other problems like human capital. So human capital needs long-term investment in your education or healthcare systems. So that takes long time. So populism cannot wait for that. And social mobility also. Inequality will compromise this. Okay. So social mobility is hindered when there is extreme inequality. Okay. So when there is extreme inequality, it becomes very difficult for mobilizing to the upward class. The transition from the low class to the top class will be difficult when there is high level of social inequality. And also it compromises the inclusive growth also. Why is it important to have inclusive growth? Because when the wealth or the resources are controlled or work only for few, we are not able to realize the potential of the nation, full potential of the nation. That is, if we also have inclusive growth, it might actually increase the GDP at least by 2 to 4% as per some study. So that is the significance of inclusive growth, which is not possible if the society is highly unequal. So these are the problems with populism and inequality, because of which the progress that a nation can achieve might be halted. So let us see what is progress and what are its contributing factors. So progress is nothing but advancements of the society in multiple aspects. It can be your science, it can be your society or economy, all this. So in economy, we have wealth and income as the progress. Okay. In society, we can have equality and justice as the progress. Okay. And in polity, we have democracy and liberalism principle as the markers of the progress. So that's how progress has multiple dimensions. So progress basically refers to the advancement of human society characterized by improvements in different aspects like your scientific knowledge, technological innovation, social equality and governance. Overall human welfare and living standards will improve if the society progresses. For most of the history, progress was probably stagnant. Why do we say this? So for a man in 500 BC and for a man in 1750 AD, the life might not have changed much because most of them are agrarian societies which are stagnant. And the rapid progress actually happened only after the Renaissance, okay, that fueled the industrial revolutions of the nations, especially Europe, okay. So industrial revolution did not happen in vacuum. It was because of the predecessor, that is Renaissance. Okay. So enlightenment and industrial revolution changed this trajectory of the progress. That means it was no more stagnant. There was rapid advancement in the progress. So scientific inquiry. So there are some principles of Renaissance which has actually fueled the industrial revolution and advancement of the society. So that is scientific inquiry, rejection of the beliefs, that is dogmatic beliefs. And earlier there used to be heavy domination of the church or religion, that is leading to a lot of superstition. Okay. So instead of this, enlightenment has actually fueled questioning. Okay. Rationalism, belief in humans' capability, that is your humanism. All these ideals have actually fueled the industrial revolution. Use of rational thought, empirical evidence as the means of governance, and also rule of law is also one consequence because of this enlightenment, because it questioned the monarchy. Okay, it questioned the monarchy, the divine right of the king to rule. So when they questioned this, the revolutions happened, like your French Revolution or the Glorious Revolution in England. So all this contributed to the modern democracies, okay, which were based on rule of law or your parliamentary democracy or separation of powers, checks and balances. All these are an offshoot of this thinking. And because of this transformation in ideas or transformation in thinking, believing in rationalism and scientific inquiry, the societies have actually transformed from medievalism to modernism. Okay. And what are the major values of the Enlightenment? They are scientific inquiry, reason, and secularism and humanism. Humanism is nothing but believing in the human's capacity to do anything. So that's how human became the center of the discourse. Okay. And also secularism. Earlier, the discourses were all about religion, philosophy, and even the educational institutions used to teach the religious teachings. So instead, after the Enlightenment, the secular subjects, that is science, maths, all these have come during this period. And reason, that is, don't believe in anything unless it is backed by some evidence. Okay, that is, it highlights the principle of rationality and scientific inquiry. Even Indian Constitution has recognized this importance and included it as a provision in 51AH, that is, your spirit of scientific inquiry and reform was included as a fundamental duty. Scientific experimentation always flourished in those societies which respect truth, okay, which respect truth and rationality. Only then we can have innovations or inventions like electricity, vaccines, and printing press. They are all possible because the societies were respecting the truth, okay. And governance based on rule of law actually provides stable environment, okay. And investments, that is long-term investments in research and development, can happen in these societies. So the societies like this can actually provide certainty in the long run because there is rule of law and reason-based governance. There will be certainty and long-term investments are attracted in such society. That's how it can contribute to the progress. So rejection of Enlightenment values risks halting the progress. So let us go through some examples where the rejection of Enlightenment values have happened in the US society, and also historically in Soviet also we can see one example. They have believed in agricultural pseudoscience and rejected the Mendelian genetic principles, okay, that led to a lot of famines in Russia. And we also see the contemporary examples like lot of fake news narratives are going on, and also the allegations of frequent election frauds might actually erode the public trust in the institutions. Then they even allege that climate change is not scientific, it is a hoax and an invention by the Chinese. So that is delaying the efforts in the fighting against the climate change. So that is one problem. And also we can see vaccine hesitancy, especially during COVID, that delayed the immediate response to the public health crisis, okay. Some believe that it might lead to autism, okay. So that's why there is a lot of vaccine hesitancy in US also. So these are different examples. So the developments like these might actually undermine the contemporary efforts towards the global fight against climate change and also erode the public trust in the institutions. It might be hampering the long-term growth, okay. So these anti-science movements and populist rhetoric are harmful for the country's progress. Any society that rejects the expertise and truth might actually fall into obscurantism, where the decisions are based on emotion rather than reason. So this is the threat we are facing because of this anti-science attitude. So what are the elements of this post-science or anti-science attitude? here we have more prominence to the emotions rather than the facts. So post-truth is nothing but a phenomena where people are likely to take decisions based on emotions rather than facts. This is happening because of the confirmation bias, which is especially amplified in the social media era, where we have echo chambers. Okay, each individual may take recourse to these echo chambers and can actually fall prey to this confirmation bias. That is, he will consume information only which will reinforce his existing ideas, and he will reject any kind of alternative views that will in fact increase the biases, okay, and conflicts, and develop lot of conflicting narratives, leading to lot of misinformation. And also we can see the elements like decline of trust in the institutions and rise of misinformation and the fake news, and also polarization is heightened in the societies, and there is relativism of the truth. Earlier, truth was perceived to be absolute, but now there is my truth and your truth. Okay, so truth also became relative. So it is seen as subjective. So what are the consequences of this post-truth era? So there are some challenges like erosion of the public discourse. That means the debates in the public will be based on emotions rather than the reason. Okay, and also even the individuals might make it difficult to decide on any issue because there is lot of conflicting narratives and he cannot have truth information. So there might be a lot of fake news or misinformation. So it is difficult for him to make any informed decision making. And also we have crisis of accountability. That is, a leader, when he thinks that a news media outlet is actually opposing his viewpoints or policies, he can simply object it, saying that it is subjective or fake news. So he might not behave accountably because he simply is not even accepting that there is a fault. Even the public will have cynicism. So there is a distrust of institutions among the public also. So there is a lot of cynicism, and identity politics will be prevalent more than the governance in the debates. So identity politics like your religion, xenophobia or region, caste, all this will dominate the political discourse rather than actual developmental or governance concerns. So these are the consequences in the post-truth era. So we can see some examples in the anti-science. Anti-science is nothing but rejection of the science. Okay. In India, we can see some examples like there is a delayed adoption of the GM crops, okay, especially the mustard and brinjal. They were adopted much later. And also during COVID, we can see that turmeric smoke can actually lead to curing of COVID disease. So this was one example of anti-science. And in 2023 NCERT, they have actually removed the Charles Darwin's theory of evolution in NCERT books. That is one example. And in 2021, we can see the inclusion of astrology in some university curricula in 2021. That is also seen as anti-science. We can also see some examples in the past, that is vaccine hesitancy, or the side effects of vaccine were perceived to be leading to infertility, that led to delayed eradication of the smallpox in India. Okay. So the vaccine was available, but the public did not consume it because of this misinformation. And in 2019 also, in India, we have Science Congress, okay, conducted, which claimed that we had interplanetary travel in ancient India that actually dented the credibility of scientific organizations in India. So these are nothing but examples of your anti-science. And then we have examples of post-truth. So initially, during the Indo-China War of 1962, Nehru was overly optimistic about the capabilities of our army and said that it is very much within our control. But after the war, it became evident that we are strategically vulnerable and our capacities are not so high, they can combat the Chinese. And in Indira Gandhi era also, we can see that Garibi Hatao slogan. This slogan is actually more a political rhetoric than actual attempt to address any kind of poverty issues, or the root causes of poverty were left behind without addressing, and she focused only on political rhetoric. That is also an example of post-truth. And in 2004 also, we can see the example like India Shining. India Shining campaign by the NDA government is actually perceived as an example of post-truth because it underplayed the widespread rural poverty and inequality. And in recent era, we can see the incidences like allegations of EVM tampering, which is arising frequently in every election. So this is a phenomena like that underscores that public trust is eroding in the democratic institutions or the electoral institutions. That is a phenomena of post-truth also. And also the delay in census. which was to be conducted in 2021, but it was delayed because of COVID and not taken up since then. But without such census or the credible data, we cannot have informed or evidence-based policy making. So it will hamper the policy making efforts to that extent. And also the examples like some rumors over the cow slaughter may actually lead to the mob lynching also. That is also an example of post-truth. That means instead of the truth, they are depending more on the rumors or emotions. Even the media is actually playing along and spreading this misinformation, because during the 2019 demonetization, we can see some media outlets have actually said 2000 nodes have nanochips which can actually track the black money. So such false information is spreading. There is also downplaying the risks of climate change, especially in the eco-sensitive zones, because we want to construct a lot of heavy infrastructure projects. So if we say there is climate change and there is a threat to eco-sensitive zone, we cannot conduct all these projects. So there is a downplaying of climate change risks, okay, to justify these projects. So how do we fight this post-truth and anti-science? Basically, we have to educate the citizens. We need to invest in grassroots activism and improve the technology regulation, okay, because social media is also contributing to fake news and misinformation, and we have to improve the mechanisms of transparency and accountability also. For example, in Finland, the education model includes media literacy and also critical problem solving or critical thinking. So that led to high ranking of Finland in the international PISA study in 2018. Okay, so this basically studies various education systems across the world and ranks them. So Finland ranked high because of these inclusions. We also have to strengthen the fact check mechanism and include the mechanisms to fight this misinformation through detection mechanisms like flagging mechanism, which is used with the Twitter and Meta also. There are some independent fact checkers to ensure the data or the details are accurate in these platforms. So we can include such mechanisms. Other mechanisms could be labeling the fake news. So any online content can be labeled as fake news. So we have to incorporate such initiatives, okay? That is to include the label mechanisms if there is any fake news. And in COVID, during the COVID, to fight the vaccine hesitancy, government has actually come up with Har Ghar Dastak initiative, where the local community health volunteers will be grabbed in to fight the vaccine hesitancy and improve the vaccination rates, especially in the underserved regions, by 17% as per the Lancet 2021 study. And then in WhatsApp also we can see the forwarding is not unlimited, it is limited. This is also a mechanism to fight the misinformation or the rapid spread of the misinformation. And in European Union, we have Digital Services Act of 2022, which has stricter regulations over the digital content. If there is any illegal information or fake information, it has to be immediately removed as per the law. So we can also incorporate such laws, and they have actually seen 22% reduction in the misinformation after the enforcement of this law. We can also have some grassroots mechanisms or campaigning mechanisms to fight the misinformation or improve the awareness among the public. For example, SEVA, that is Self-Employed Women's Association, has actually raised the awareness about the climate change risks and what are the solutions in the short term and long term. Okay, so this is one initiative where there is grassroots campaigning to fight the misinformation. And also in polio, we can see vaccine hesitation was actually solved by grabbing in a lot of celebrities. Okay, like Amitabh Bachchan was included in campaigning for polio vaccination. This also helped in fighting the misinformation and reducing the vaccine hesitancy among the population. And we can also improve the transparency, accountability mechanisms also, and increase the public trust. There is no other way we can improve the trust of the public. We have to focus on improving this transparency and accountability mechanisms, because state is always known for improving its secrecy mechanisms. So transparency can actually improve the public trust. We can also improve the data, study, research also. Before any kind of policy decisions are made, we can have informed decision making based on reason rather than emotion by including evidence-based policy making in every aspect of governance. So Niti Aayog is already doing this, okay? So such mechanisms can be strengthened further. Rise of oligarchic capitalism. So the author also says, we have seen a rise of oligarchic capitalism, especially in the US, okay? In US, we have seen wealth inequality is at all-time high, okay? Since the 1920s, the top 1% Americans actually own 34% of the nation's wealth, whereas the bottom 50% hold just 2%, okay? This is highlighting the stark inequalities in the American society. Okay, that is one criticism of the capitalistic economies. And in 2010, we have seen a Citizens United case, because of which the companies or the corporates can actually fund in an unlimited manner to the political parties. That has actually led to lot of political lobbying. Okay, that means it might lead to oligarchic capitalism. Oligarchy is nothing but concentration of the power in few individuals or entities, like your tech giants, okay, and very few companies. Okay, they might overtake the governance or the power aspects, so their interest will be prioritized over the public welfare. That is the problem with oligarchic capitalism. We can draw some Indian correlations also here. In electoral bond scheme, we can see that anonymity of the donor is protected by the law, and also after the 2017 Finance Act, we can actually see there are unlimited donations by the companies are allowed after this act. So in India also, inequality is stark. So as per the Oxfam studies, there is high level of inequality. 40% of wealth is concentrated in the top 1% alone, and the bottom 50% holds only 3% wealth. And also the income, this is about wealth. What about the income then? 57% of the income generated every year actually goes to just 10%. That is, the top 10% has all the income, and the bottom 50% earns only 13% of the income. What about the GST revenue then? So GST revenue, majority of it comes from the bottom 50%. Okay, so 64% of the revenue actually comes from the bottom 50%, whereas the top 10% gives only 3% of the GST. So this is as per Oxfam Survival of the Richest study in 2023. Indirect taxes like GST might be regressive because they have negative impact on the poorer, and it will impact everyone equally, even the rich and the poor, because it is indirect tax, not the direct tax. In fact, the direct taxes like corporate tax have actually reduced from 30 to 22% in India. Okay, and in 2022, we can see World Inequality Report, which says that post-liberalization, bottom 50% income has actually stagnated. There is no much growth, whereas the top 1% saw exponential growth in their income and wealth. So this highlights that there is stark inequality in Indian society also. What are the problems with these oligarchic systems? Oligarchic systems are problematic because they focus on the policies which are beneficial to few, okay, who are already powerful. It can be the industries, it can be your companies, okay. Whoever has contributed to the political elite might actually benefit with the policy formulation, compromising the public welfare and creating some moral hazards like exploitation and political corruption. So these are the challenges of the oligarchic systems. So we can see one example, that is in Russia, oligarchs. There are a lot of oligarchs, okay, especially in oil and gas, media. Russia has oligarchs, and these oligarchs have actually supported Putin, okay, in return for some favorable policies and also protection. So we can see the problem with the oligarchic capitalism by understanding the example of Russia. Even in India, we can have some correlations, like 88% of the MPs in the 17th Lok Sabha are actually millionaires, okay. And in the past also, we have seen some examples of politician businessman nexus, okay, that is crony capitalism, that actually led to some scams like 2G spectrum and coal scam. All these are examples of this. And even Adani is an example, because 98% of his wealth have actually generated in the last decade alone. That is, his wealth was just $2.8 billion in 2014, but it became $155 billion in 2022, okay. And also in 2019, the corporate tax has actually reduced from 30% to 22%. We can see this as a correlation to the oligarchic capitalism in US also. One major consequence of this oligarchic capitalism, that is the negative consequence, is decline in the public spending. For example, during the Trump's presidency, we get to see a lot of budget cuts, okay. The scientific research funding was slashed, okay, by 16%. This affected research, which is critical in areas like renewable energy, health, and also space exploration, okay. That is making US less competitive, okay. It is compromising the competitive edge it has earlier. So investing in research and development is crucial for a nation's progress, especially to grab the competitive edge compared to the other nations. So Trump also proposed that there will be cutting of National Institutes of Health budget by 18%, okay. And this also will impact research on cancer and Alzheimer's. Whereas in Japan and Germany, we can see increase in the public spending in research and innovation. So that might actually give it some competitive technological edge also. And 16% of the American children actually live in poverty. So it is not trying to address these issues. And in global rankings also, US students rank 25th in science, okay, and 30th in math. So these are the facts highlighted by Joseph Stiglitz to say that oligarchic capitalism might actually prevent the government from focusing on the pressing national issues. And even the life expectancy in US is 77 years, which is lowest among the G7 countries, that is your UK or other European nations, okay. And US is the lowest in life expectancy among the G7 nations. We can see some correlations in India also, that is the R&D spending in India is much less. It is less than 1% of its GDP compared to the global average of 2.2%. And also according to the Acer study, okay, of 2022, 27% of class 8 students failed to do a simple math calculation like division or multiplication. That highlights our public education is not so strong. And 75% of the rural schools lack the functional toilets. There may be toilets, but they are not functional, because of which there can be high dropout rates among the adolescent girls. And our healthcare spending is also less compared to the global average of 10%. We spend only 3% of our GDP on the public health. The article says that if you underfund your research or if you underinvest in your public infrastructure or human capital, you might actually risk losing the competitive edge you have so far. The author says that humanity faces three major existential challenges. One is the possibility of misuse of artificial intelligence and nuclear proliferation. We can see that in North Korea example, it has actually proliferated and expanded its nuclear arsenal. And also immediate challenge, that is climate change, is also one major existential threat of humanity. So the technology has actually capable of fighting these challenges, but time is a critical issue here. So we can see there is a delayed response or delayed reaction to all the global major challenges like climate change agreements. So delayed action might actually lead to irreversible damage. So how do we fight these challenges? The author says there is no other way rather than reinforcing the enlightenment values of reason, rationality, scientificism, all these. Okay. History has shown that the progress will be fragile. Only with reinforcement of such values, you can see progress in the long run in a sustainable manner. Even during Hitler, Germany saw a lot of pseudoscience, okay, that ultimately led to Holocaust, World War II, all these, okay. The author says there is no shortcut to fight these challenges. We have to enforce the enlightenment values. We have to enforce collective action, shared prosperity mechanisms, and ethical governance. So these are the way forward to ensure the growth is sustainable and also equitable. What do we mean by shared prosperity? It is nothing but investing in human capital, that is your universal education and health, okay? Universal access to quality education, not just normal, but quality education, and healthcare systems must be accessible to everyone and must be free or heavily subsidized. And also, all the economic decisions must be based on environmental sustainability concept, because only then you can ensure there is long-term growth. So transitioning into a renewable energy and cutting emissions is crucial for environmental sustainability. Only then there can be shared prosperity. That's how the article concludes, okay? So you can see some sample questions for essay, that is your economic inequality, social progress cannot coexist, okay? And populism and inequality, are they symptoms or causes of democratic decline? So these can be your sample essay questions. You can practice with them. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to Abhiram IAS Academy.